Man, it's dark here. There's so much space to do something. Maybe we can manipulate it somehow. Here, let's put a dot. Cool, that's a dot. In the history of video games, the dot was a simple way of representing something we could interact with, and the first generation of gaming revolved solely around that dot. But that dot is lonely, so let's add another. 2 dots. But how could they interact with each other? Let's add a third dot, make it smaller, let it bounce back and forth. This is kind of like tennis. I like it. But let's make it even more. What happens if we take 2 dots and connect them? We have a line. The platformer genre, in theory, involved removing that visible line and instead focusing on getting from point A to point B.
And holy fuck, we have a genre. When you play platformers, the objective is almost always to reach a certain goal or location. The difficulty comes into play by introducing obstacles and making the platforms you walk on difficult to maneuver around. Through time, the video game industry would handle platformer games differently, adding different mechanics, sprites, and elements that would make some games stand out more than others. Let's travel all the way back to 1981, with what is considered by many to be the first platformer game, Nintendo's Donkey Kong. In the game, you would go from point A to point B, dodging obstacles that would get progressively more difficult as you fought for the elusive high score. But let's be honest, Donkey Kong may not actually be the first platformer game out there. Trust us, there's much more to the genre historically than meets the eye.
So let's take what we know about the platformer genre and mix it up a little bit, analyzing the different styles of platformer games and then the titles that made the genre what it is today. Games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Kato and Ken, Strider, Bubsy, Mario, and more. Older arcade games are really archaic, but so many of them paved the way for modern video gaming. The first generation of arcade titles, specifically platformers, were known as single-screen games. What does this mean? Well, it means the stage is rendered in a static environment, and programming brings the rest of the elements together. Think of Donkey Kong. You have Mario at the bottom, and the stage, for the most part, has rigid elements that stay the same. But here's the cool thing. Donkey Kong wasn't the first game to do this. Universal's Space Panic was the first major arcade title that had a protagonist moving up and down, while the environment was manipulated. Universal would go on to be rebranded as Aruze or Aruz, but Space Panic was an interesting game to say the least. You moved up and down ladders and you dug holes to lure aliens into them. You also have Oxygen, which acts as a stage timer. And as a little tidbit of information, Space Panic is based on Hyankyo Alien from 1979, which was a top-down game, but Kazutoshi Ueda, one of the Universal designers, converted it into a side-view format, and thus Space Panic brought Hyankyo Alien to a different perspective. In the future, this mechanic would be used and abused by another company, Broderbund, who would develop the Lode Runner series.
Another notable attempt at early platforming that predated Donkey Kong was Nichibutsu's Crazy Climber, where you scaled a skyscraper. It wasn't really successful, even though it was ported to many consoles. The big single screener that mattered, and ultimately that was attributed to the whole start of the platformer genre, was Donkey Kong. So now you're caught up. But what happened when the next greatest thing needed to come into play? With Donkey Kong, Nintendo started a chain reaction of people wanting to create similar games. Smurf, Rescue in Gargamel's Castle, Bubble Bobble, Fairyland Story, Manic Miner, and its sequel, Jet Set Willy, are all just small examples of how impactful this era of platforming was. But we need to move on from just this screen. Let's instead create a world, one that moves and one that allows the consumer to feel part of something much bigger. And honestly, it didn't take long for people to figure it out. Alpha Denshi, one of the in-house developers for SNK, created a title called Jump Bug. The title had platformer elements and allowed the consumer to control a buggy that would fire back at enemies. This happened only 5 months after the release of Donkey Kong. If you paid attention to our episode about Irem, their big claim to fame was the 1982 arcade game Moon Patrol. 1 month later, Taito would join the fray with Jungle King.
As we moved on, everything started getting more involved. Track Attack would show us the ability for a playable character to move along a train, jumping from train to train. But the physical motion of the character in this simple game would inspire other side-scrollers, specifically Prince of Persia. However, one company would release a landmark title to push the rest of the competition out of the way: Nintendo, with their 1985 NES release of Super Mario Bros., bringing us to the 2D era of platforming. It's the mid-80s. Right now, the industry is reeling from a major crash, and to put it into perspective, we here at the Ready Go Gaming Show consider the video game industry to consist of 3 different spectrums: home consoles, arcades, and ultimately, computers. In the early 80s, the home console market was ultra saturated, and the industry crashed. This paved the way for arcades and computers to come to prevalence, but the truth is, Nintendo's NES saved the home console spectrum, and games like Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. Led the charge. To this date, Super Mario Bros. Has sold 40 million copies, at least according to the 1999 Guinness Book of World Records.
The gaming industry works very quickly, and it didn't take long for Nintendo's Japanese competitor Sega to create their answer, Alex Kidd. In many ways, this started a long, bitter rivalry between Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo would focus on Donkey Kong and Mario, while Sega would make Alex Kidd and Wonder Boy. Each of these titles in their own way inspired other games, titles like Adventure Island, Popful Mail, Shantae, Brain Breaker, and more. Plus, we had some really awesome companies create platformers for the NES that stood out among the competition as well. Let's not forget Konami's Castlevania and Capcom's Mega Man. As time went on, this rivalry carried over to the 4th generation of gaming, this time with the Sega Genesis and Nintendo's Super Nintendo. Nintendo would up the ante with Super Mario World, and then Sega's answer would be Sonic the Hedgehog and any variants of Shinobi that they could shit out to the general public. Another thing to consider is that while the SNES and Genesis were duking it out, the computer spectrum was thriving. The Commodore Amiga had some wonderfully unique platformers as well, such as Shadow of the Beast. Additionally, id Software was kicking ass with Commander Keen, and Apogee was creating Duke Nukem and Dark Ages. If you were keen on platformers, it was definitely a time to be alive. But even with the big two creating tons of games in this genre, there was always an inherent need to make it bigger and better. But at the time, the next big thing was 3D. And unfortunately, many game developers at the time didn't know how to handle that.
As we enter the next generation of gaming, we were exposed to what was known as 2.5D platforming. Essentially, this meant that games were presented on a 2D plane with 3D graphics. But to be fair, it had been attempted a while back. Are you familiar with isometric views? Forte hates them, but it's a unique way of making 3D elements work with the limitations at the time. We'll break down the subgenres and their history a little later in the episode. But now it's time to move on to the 3D era of gaming, where we saw the true power of Nintendo with its Nintendo 64.
2.5D was unique, and for the most part, was great. But in the wrong hands, not so much. For example, Crash Bandicoot was 2.5D done right, while Sonic Extreme and Bubsy 3D, well, it went really fucking wrong. True 3D, again, was really hard to manage, and for those who could figure it out first, the rewards would be massive. The first company to truly attempt a true 3D platformer was a company named Exact. The game they made was called Geograph Seal. It was a 3D platformer with shooting elements controlling a mech that could double jump. This mechanic was utilized for their next game, Jumping Flash, and holy shit, we have 3D on a modern console, the PS1. Nintendo, however, wouldn't be caught dead being one-up by some orange marsupial or a jumping game, not when they had their own resident Italian plumber that was more than capable of exploring the 3D realms. Which is what they did with 1996's Super Mario 64, a virtual camera, a free-flowing world, motion that was unparalleled, just so many degrees of freedom for the consumer to enjoy. Plus, collecting stars? Yeah, that's nice, let's collect things. And boy, did we fucking collect things. We collected Jiggies and Banjo-Kazooie, gems and Spyro the Dragon, and bananas and coins and coconuts, and well, everything in Donkey Kong 64. So much so that it's recognized in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the most collectible items in any video game. It's the 1990s and the pinnacle of the 5th generation of gaming where worlds are being formed. Almost all genres were equally represented on these consoles: RPGs, FPS, action-adventure games, and ultimately platformers. As we move onwards, games started evolving heavily. Worlds became massive, legacy franchises evolved to go to the distance and replicate our experiences for a new generation of gamers. Mascots came and went, the indie market rose to relevance.
To this day, platformers have evolved tremendously. Those franchises we still love to hate and hate to love still thrive. Mario, Sonic, Psychonauts, Bionic Commando, Limbo, Braid, you name it, it's there, and the platform genre isn't really going anywhere. We've covered the aspects of the history from point A to B, the true objective in a platformer, and where we started so long ago at the beginning of gaming. That being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the subgenres that fall under platformers before we hop into the next part where we talk about some of the franchises that made this genre awesome.
Before we get into the meat and bones of some of the best platformers out there, or at least in our editorial opinion, the most impactful franchises in the genre, let's go ahead and talk about some of the subgenres and spin-offs of the platformer genre, starting with puzzle platformers. Puzzle games go way back. Everyone loves using their noggin to solve problems, and honestly, introducing platforms to puzzle games introduced a really interesting spin on the genre. Historically, the first two games that stand out in the puzzle platform genre are Enix's Door Door and Sega's Doki Doki Penguin Land. Door Door was a PC 8801 and Famicom Japanese exclusive puzzle platformer that follows the single screen idea. You play as Chun and go around trapping aliens. Sega's take, Doki Doki Penguin Land, was covered in the Sega episode way back in Season 1. Basically, you move an egg around, and if it falls too far, it breaks.
As time went on, the environments that puzzle platformers were involved in radically changed, as did the mechanics. The Lost Vikings is a great example of games where you would control multiple characters. Wario Land would be Nintendo's definitive contribution through the 90s for the subgenre, and eventually once the modern era began, titles such as Valve's Portal would lead the pack. You like running, you like gunning, you like dealing with platforms, maybe even dying a lot? Well then run and gun games might be right up your alley. Historically, the first major run and gun game to receive notoriety and fame was Konami's Contra, but run and gun games were massively popular in the arcades with titles such as SNK's Akari Warriors, Capcom's Commando, and more. Once this subgenre hopped to the console market, titles such as Gunstar Heroes and Metal Slug would continue to kick ass. Through time, a plethora of franchises have been born from this subgenre, to include Cuphead.
Did you know there's a genre for platformers that are really slow and boring to most people? Ever played Another World or Out of This World? What about the original Prince of Persia? How about games that aren't poopy like Limbo, Inside, Weird Dreams, The Way, or Oddworld? I'm talking about cinematic platform games, titles that feel like experiences versus actual games. The big distinguishable factor for cinematics is that it has more of a sense of hyperrealism in how they're played. Most of your movements with the character are fluid and the physics are just god tier. 80% of the time, many cinematics are trial and error, which isn't for everyone, but hey, if it is, it is.
Comical platforms are cutesy poopsy. They're known as CAGs in Japan, which stands for Comical Action Games. The original Mario Brothers in the arcades is an example of a CAG, but Bubble Wobble also fits the bill for this. Most of the time, CAGs are a single screen. They don't tend to scroll and oftentimes have two-player competitive aspects. This is a very Japanese style of platforming. We talked about isometric perspectives earlier in the episode, but the ability to use isometric views radically changed how we managed to deal with the transition to 3D. The first major isometric game to really matter was Zaxxon from Sega, but that's a shooter so we can't really count it. Sega also created Congo Bongo, which we can count. There's a bunch of isometric platformers, and unfortunately many of them aren't worth much replayability-wise. Remember Sonic 3D Blast? Do you really remember Sonic 3D Blast? Well, that's an isometric platformer. PAGs. Well, you probably don't call them PAGs, but many people did. Tons of exploration, tons of enemies, tons of items. Bunches of games did that, but Metroid and Castlevania decided to get romantically involved, and boom, Metroidvanias were born. Metroid was a huge influence in establishing the exploration Metroidvania genre. checking every nook and cranny for the tools you need to progress the game, its influence can be seen echoing across the generations in games like Symphony of the Night, Hollow Knight, Ori and the Blind Forest, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, Blasphemous, and many, many more.
And this brings us to our final platformer example, Endless Runners. If you're like me, and like many other people, the first major Endless Runner you remember was, well, Temple Run. It had 50 million installations within 13 days, so I think it's fair to say it was awesome. But if you want the beginning of this trend, look at 2009's Cannibalt. It's a unique experimental title that definitely planted the seed of interest for Endless Runners. And that's all the little subgenres. If you think we missed something, feel free to tell us down below. But we've covered all the aspects of platformers from the beginning to the end, covered the subgenres, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the most impactful and popular platformers of the era. Bear in mind, this genre does have a ton of video games, so we can only cover so much, but hopefully you see something that you like.
When you think of platformers, you likely think of chasing monkeys. At least that was the gimmick in the original Donkey Kong games, right? Well, Japan Studio, the same studio that would bring us Parappa the Rapper and Wild Arms, created a game where you literally chased apes in 1999, Ape Escape. In the game, you play as Spike, who has a helmet that has numerous gadgets. You utilize these gadgets to travel across time to prevent apes empowered by some goon named Spectre from rewriting the world's history. It was highly experimental, highly abstract, and highly fun.
Ape Escape 2 was released 3 years later for the PS2, with basically the same principle, but with a different plot. You have a few more gadgets and a fancy new monkey sidekick, Pipochi. You play as Hikaru, who in the US version is known as Jimmy, who is told by a professor to deliver a load of monkey pants. Your fellow NPC Natsumi, who also helps manage the park with her grandfather, the professor, messes up the order and sends tons of these monkey helmets that make them do hood rat shit. So yeah, basically the first game all over again in a nutshell. The last major line release of Ape Escape was Ape Escape 3 in 2005, and again, it's the same principle. Ape Escape is a novelty series that generated 14 total titles, so if you're all about doing the same thing with almost no deviations, and in some cases engaging in fan service spin-offs, then yeah, look into it. Banjo-fucking-Kazooie. On the Nintendo 64, we had a bunch of platformers, but for the most part, the only company that seemed to truly do it right was Rare. Rare was popular because they did a bunch of NES titles in the late 80s, but their real contributions, for the most part, were platformers. We're talking Donkey Kong 64, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and Banjo-Kazooie. But here's the issue. Rare as a company is a prime example of one of those companies that really goes the extra mile to waste your time. A vast majority of their games feature false endings, and almost all of their Nintendo 64 games involved collectathons. Banjo-Kazooie was no exception. In the game, you play as Banjo the Bear, who lives near Spiral Mountain. You want to know who else lives in Spiral Mountain? Well, a gigantic cacophony of bullshit. Carrot monsters, cauliflowers, a mole named Bottles that can't see farther than his nose, Banjo the Bear, his Breagull companion Kazooie, Banjo's sister Tootie, and this dummy thick bitch that does gross shit named Gruntilda. She's obsessed with trying to be hot for Hot Witch Summer and kidnaps Tootie to steal her perceived beauty. That being said, Banjo-Kazooie embark on a rescue mission and collect a fuck ton of eggs, notes, jiggies, and minutes of your childhood. The game is long, the ending is tedious, and through, it's a collectathon.
The sequel, Banjo-Tooie, was the universally acclaimed and severely requested title released in 2000. Tooie was a different beast. Instead of simply going into worlds and collecting things, everything felt like one big, solid, connected world, which involved a lot of backtracking to accomplish objectives. The puzzles and platforming are still there, and if you're a fan of N64 titles, look no further than this. But unfortunately, that's where it ceased to be fun. The next few games were fan service attempts that didn't really fit the bill. Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge on the GBA was lackluster at best, and Banjo Pilot failed to be the answer to Rare's Diddy Kong Racing, and finally, Nuts and Bolts was a kick to the nuts and bolts, if you catch my drift. As gimmicky as it was, Banjo-Kazooie was a great series, and soon we'll be covering Rare in an episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show special relatively soon, so feel free free to check that out when it happens.
Konami, that's a household name for some of the most difficult platformers to arise on the NES. Castlevania follows the Belmont clan through their various endeavors to kill Dracula like 400 times. There are many games, and this franchise will generate a franchise episode on the next season of the Ready Go Gaming Show, so we don't want to get too far into it. What we will say is that Castlevania was unique in the way that it evolved to generate its own style of gameplay. From the original Castlevania on the NES all the way to Castlevania Bloodlines, the series focused on what we would know as traditional platforming. But once Symphony of the Night was released, then the Metroidvania boom began. The replayability of these games was insane, and Konami seems to have made like 75% of their Castlevania entries in this new format, which, for me, I really like.
This isn't really a franchise because it is a singular game, but the impact that it had on the indie circuit was enough to make it show up on this list. Celeste is a beautiful game, and it was made in only 4 days. Literally, it was for a game jam, and it exceeded expectations at least 20-fold. You play as a young lady named Madeline, whose job is to climb to the top of a fictional version of Mount Celeste. You use skills like dashing to navigate really hard puzzles and terrain, kind of in the breadth of Super Meat Boy, but it's like 500 times more playable. It's a true rite of passage game for indie connoisseurs.
We already went fairly deep into Crash Bandicoot earlier in the last season of the Ready Go Gaming Show, when we talked about Activision and Blizzard, so there's no point to rehash it out. Naughty Dog made platforming fun. And while we might not have Uncharted on this list because it's an action-adventure game with parkour elements, same as Assassin's Creed, we only feel it's fair to bring up Crash because it kickstarted a frenzy. Crash was more than just a platformer. It was a literal platform of gold that Sony stood on from a mascot perspective for a long time. Crash was the voice of the PS1. But in terms of games, the franchise did fizzle out after the PS1 and PS2 era of gaming. Sure, there have been more games released, but the originals are definitely a novelty. If you still want to relive those moments with a fresh coat of paint, then check out the N. Sane trilogy. We can't talk about the run and gun subgenre and leave out Contra. Released in 1987 for the arcades, Contra was Konami's take on making platformers a little bit more spicy. With tons of power-ups and enemies and one-hit KOs, this game is infamous for setting the difficulty curve in run-and-gun games. We'll be covering Contra in depth this season when we talk about Konami, so all you need to know is that there were 19 games in the Contra series, and for the most part, they've held up.
You know, a lot of people talk about Contra being the biggest run-and-gun title. And to be honest, they wouldn't be wrong, but if we talk about modern run-and-gun games, the most infamous one has to be Cuphead. Cuphead is a run-and-gun game that sometimes utilizes shoot-'em-up elements, with a unique 1930s art style that is 100% hand-drawn, and a difficulty curve that is truly phenomenal. Cuphead took the gaming industry by storm when it was released in 2017. You play as Cuphead and Mugman, who go to the Devil's Casino and play craps, but make a deal with the devil that results in them having to do his bidding. It's a really cool game with a cool little redemption arc, and like we said, beautiful art. Definitely check it out.
We've already covered Donkey Kong in the Mario episode, which is something we'll talk about a few times, but truth be told, Donkey Kong was a golden standard for arcade platformers. Once the jump to consoles happened, there was practically endless opportunities for Donkey Kong and his friends and family to have their own unique stories surrounding the ambitious shenanigans of King K. Rool. It's nice to see that Donkey Kong still thrives in his own realm, though. Earthworm Jim was a very novelty game. Back in the 90s, there were tons of attempts at making the next best platformer. There's also a time where toy franchises were attempting to take the world by storm. Now, the whole concept of Earthworm Jim was based around Playmates Toys, who had just found a massive success with having a license for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and wanted their own little franchise. At the time, Sonic was kicking ass, so why not launch a toy franchise based around a video game? Well, that's exactly what they did. Shiny Entertainment would approach Doug TenNapel and take the idea of Earthworm Jim from a sketch that he did, and what was created was Earthworm Jim for the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, a hybrid platformer with run-and-gun elements. The truth is, Shiny Entertainment made a handful of games, so realistically even making a special on them would be doable, but impractical. This is the same company that made MDK, Wild 9, Enter the Matrix Path of Neo, novelty titles in their own niche markets. But Earthworm Jim was the start, as was the sequel Earthworm Jim 2. Now, reviews of Earthworm Jim 1 and 2 are both hit and miss because it's truly a game that you either like or you don't. It was tough, the game was unforgiving, and the direction and linearity of the game was hell to deal with. But the catch to that is, if you liked it, you liked it.
Then they pooped out an Earthworm Jim to contend with Banjo-Kazooie and DK64, and it wasn't great. It was simply called Earthworm Jim 3D, and it was plagued with tons of problems that stemmed from an extended development cycle. Tons of assets were left out. The TV show that was generated from the original Genesis games was long off TV, so many kids didn't know who he was unless they grew up in that time period. To make matters worse, David Perry, who bought the initial rights to EJ, had already sold the rights, so he had no directional input on it. Even Ten Napel, the creator of the original sketch, claimed that EJ3D ruined the entire franchise. EJ3D would be followed up by Earthworm Jim Menace to the Galaxy, but it was a Game Boy Color game and it was horrible. It didn't even remotely feel like an Earthworm Jim game, outside of the fact that it was named it. They yanked his whip attack, which was the key way of surviving if you ran out of bullets, and it wasn't good. There have been long talks about making Earthworm Jim 4, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
One of Capcom's highest grossing franchises, Ghosts 'n Goblins was one of the toughest, in-your-face platformers of its time. To make matters worse, in order to beat it, you had to beat it twice. Imagine doing that in the arcade. It would be obnoxious. However, if you manage to beat it in the arcade twice, then as far as I'm concerned, you're a fucking gaming god. This franchise as a whole is a rite of passage in every major console it's represented on, from the NES to the SNES to the Game Boy with its spin-off Gargoyles Quest. Remember Maximo? That's a Ghosts 'n Goblins title too, believe it or not, and just as difficult.
Hollow Knight won't be the only Knight we mention in this episode, but hey, the second Knight isn't related to this one at all. Shovel Knight and Hollow Knight are two different games from two different companies that might share a similar name but have nothing to do with one another. Shovel Knight is a side-scrolling platformer, but Hollow Knight is more of an experience. It's a Metroidvania with tons of inspiration. The music, the world, the character design, the combat, it's perfect. Expect tons of difficult fights, beautiful moments, and frustration.
Now this is what I'm talking about, Jak and Daxter. Now this franchise was a powerful entry on the PS2. When you think of 3D platformers, there exists this holy trifecta of entries. Jak and Daxter is one of those. The other two would be Sly Cooper and then Ratchet & Clank. They're simply badass games. Anyway, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy was released in 2001 for the PS2 exclusively. The main character Daxter falls into dark eco and turns into an Ottsel akin to Gex or any one-liner comedic support. Jak, his loyal friend, goes on a journey to undo the magic, and holy heck, we have a game. The Precursor Legacy was a universal success. It was nice to see Naughty Dog doing more platforming, especially since their Crash Bandicoot adventures on the PS1.
Then we had the sequel Jak 2, which featured Jak and Daxter going to Haven City using a rift gate and being imprisoned by the Crimson Guard, who experimented on him and created Dark Eco Jak, which is a key mechanic of the game. If you enjoyed the first game, you might enjoy the second, but it was chock full of backtracking and missions that were incredibly difficult. The last main installment was Jak 3, which featured the same cast of characters going to the Wasteland to clear the named after the events of Jak 2. There were a handful of other games, but we'll cover them during the Naughty Dog special at some point in the future.
Sega had experience with tons of platformers, namely Wonder Boy and Alex Kidd, and then of course Sonic, but they did capitalize on working with a Disney IP with the Illusion series. The first title, Castle of Illusion, featured Mickey going through tons of worlds behind doors to rescue Minnie from Mizrabel. These levels included the Enchanted Forest, Toyland, the Storm, Dessert Factory, the Library, and finally, the Castle. It's a cute game and totally fits the bill for platforming and opened the floodgates for more Mickey-styled platforming titles. While the original was released on the Genesis and Mega Drive, it did receive a Game Gear version as well, which wasn't abnormal at all for many games at the time for Sega. But the true sequel was Land of Illusion on the SMS. The plot is simple. Mickey falls asleep while reading a book and wakes up in a strange village. Daisy Duck comes up and asks him for help because some phantom stole the village's magic crystal, and yeah, this game has nothing to do with its predecessor, nor does it have anything to do with its sequel, World of Illusion. World of Illusion was awesome because it had Mickey and Donald Duck, which could be selected individually or as a co-op. So this game is a couch co-op in some ways.
Then we hop back to the Game Gear for Legend of Illusion in 1995. It wasn't great, and the series was all but dead for a long time, until they decided to remake the original game in 2013. It looks really good. The key thing to remember is that the success of these individual games directly impacted the future of Mickey Mouse in his own games, specifically Epic Mickey. In fact, Epic Mickey Power of Illusion is a direct tribute to where it all started. Great series. Kirby actually has an entire episode planned around him in the future, but this lovable pink ball of goo with mad suck powers was a staple in HAL Labs' franchise listing for a long time. Kirby has all but permanently been associated with Nintendo, and for good reason. He's a charming, simple platformer that goes the extra mile to make sure you have fun and exciting experiences. It all started with Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy, developed by Masahiro Sakurai. You know, Smash Daddy? Yeah, Smash Daddy. Originally known as Popopo of the Spring Breeze, Kirby would eventually find his namesake in a pissed-off warehouse landlord. True story. But with tons of games under his belt, this simple platforming experience will accurately be covered during the franchise episode for Kirby this season. We promise.
This one is obscure, not by choice, but because it was so in the background when compared to the other titles in the genre, namely Kirby. Honestly, this game is a more well-defined Kirby-style game on the PS1. The first game was Klonoa Door to Phantomile, which was a simple 2.5D side-scroller game with backgrounds fully rendered in 3D. You play as the titular character Klonoa, who can grab enemies and use a large ring that bears the power of Hugh Pow, his friend. It's like Dig Dug on acid, except you just kind of move left and right. We will cover more of this franchise in the Namco episode coming up this year, so keep a lookout for it.
Limbo is a minimalistic puzzle platformer made by Playdead in 2010. It was black and white and had tons of cinematic techniques that truly made it an experience to play through. With elements of film noir and German expressionism, this game is a work of art. It's no surprise this game is considered one of the greatest games ever made. You play as a boy who can move in all directions, utilizing the elements that surround him to advance the story. He wakes up at the edge of hell, hence Limbo, and goes on an adventure to find his sister. It's a really good time and a really nice puzzle platformer if you're into that style of gaming.
Are you down with LBP? No, not me. LBP is the series created by Media Molecule and featuring Sackboy, little brown ragdoll. The big thing that rocked about this game was that it was a major staple on the PS3 when it dropped. Users could create their own unique worlds and share levels with friends, so think of this as Mario Maker before Mario Maker was ever a thing, but all in all, it's just a physics-based platformer. There's tons of customization, and there were many games released, such as 3 main platform releases and some knockoff spin-offs. There is a plot for each of them, but we don't want to spoil it. We already covered Mario, so just, go back and look at the Mario episode. Okay.
Can you stop giving me stuff we've already talked about? Mega Man was the last episode of the Ready Go Gaming show, so what are you doing? Hit that subscribe button. Damn it, Fort. Nintendo episode. Come on, man. There we go. Geez, Oddworld. Now, we talked about cinematic platformers earlier. There's a common trope that runs with cinematic games, and it usually involves a metric ton of trial and error. Oddworld is unfortunately no exception. You're gonna die about 500 million times. It's the same as Out of This World or Another World. It's inevitable. Anyway, the first game was Oddworld: Abe's Odyssey. You play as Abe, who is a slave at a meat processing factory who learns that the meat products he creates are made out of his fellow species. So he has to escape while freeing all of his friends. You have puzzles, songs, farts. It's silly, but one of the most innovative games of its time.
Then we immediately had a spin-off of the main series with Oddworld: Abe's Exodus. The story continues as expected. Abe escapes and then finds out the Gluckins, who are the bad guys in the first game, have another plot against Abe's race, the Mudokons. This time, Abe is going on an adventure to prevent a drink called Soulstorm Brew, which is made with Mudokon bones and tears as key ingredients. Literally, Abe is an agricultural advocate. Not a bad game at all. The follow-up was Oddworld: Munch's Odyssey for the Xbox exclusively. It was originally designed for the PS2, but yeah, life happens. Again, the plot is similar, but the gameplay is radically different, and that's mostly due in part for creative growth. You just have to play it to get it. It's 3D, it's goofy, it's all over the place, and certainly wasn't as charming as the predecessors.
The big departure for the franchise was Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath, where you play a stranger the bounty hunter and you just collect bounties. That's literally it. It was a commercial failure, even though it was generally positively reviewed. But hey, want to enjoy the original feel of Abe's Odyssey without the guilt of playing the PS1 game and trying to rip your fucking hair out? Well, sucks to be you, because they remade the original as Oddworld New and Tasty. It's a ground-up remake of the original game, and to be honest, it's awesome. You'll still probably end up pulling your hair out though, but just give it a shake, trust me. It's literally the same game, just better. The most recent iteration was Oddworld Soulstorm, which came out in 2021, and it is fucking gorgeous, except the idea at this point in time was played out, and it really wasn't received that well. Oh well. If you like a novelty experience, and honestly give the Oddworld series a try. It's a unique little story with very unique cinematics.
When you think of Metroidvanias, you think of the usual suspects. Metroid? Castlevania? But Ori and the Blind Forest and its sequel Ori and the Will of the Wisps is perhaps one of the greatest Metroidvanias out there, both in visual aesthetics as well as gameplay. Inspired by The Lion King, The Iron Giant, Rayman, and Metroid, this definitive Metroidvania was the product of Moon Studios and a high contender for one of the best platformer titles ever made. You definitely need to check it out. We don't want to ruin the plot because much like Limbo, it's an experience you should have on your own. Trust us.
When you think of cinematic platformers, look no further than Prince of Persia. Although the first iterations of the franchise were dramatically different than the later entries, we'll go ahead and cover it to some capacity. The first Prince of Persia title was made by Broderbund for the Apple II. The game itself is incredibly fucking boring, but that's subjective to the person. It's a very physically specific title where you have to escape a dungeon before time runs out, with 12 levels of traps, high falls, and sword fights. It wasn't immediately, commercially successful, but it did spawn an entire franchise and even more ports of the original title. If the system existed during the time a port was made, I'm talking 40 different versions of the original Prince of Persia.
It did receive a relatively unknown sequel with Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, and for the most part, it's the same experience. Plot-wise, it takes place 11 days after the previous game and involves the antagonist Jafar, also from the previous game, doing some weird stuff in the dream world. Yeah, just play it if you want. This time the game was only ported to 5 consoles, so comparatively speaking, it didn't have nearly the same cultural impact as the first game. The final part of the original cinematic trilogy was Prince of Persia 3D in 1999, released for the PC and Dreamcast. But it's very much an action-adventure title presented in 3D with weird tank controls, and it's rough. After this, the franchise would be sold to Ubisoft and would inevitably be rebooted as the Prince of Persia that we know of today. We'll cover the rest of the history of Prince of Persia in the Ubisoft episode coming up this season.
Released in 2005 by Double Fine Productions, Psychonauts is one of the coolest games we've seen in the genre in a long time. It was born from a scrapped idea by Tim Schafer during the development of the LucasArts point-and-click game Full Throttle. In Psychonauts, you play as Rasputin, who has psychic abilities, who runs away from the circus to sneak into a summer camp for people with similar abilities. There's this evil little plot going on at the camp, and only Raz can stop it. And even though many people enjoy this game, it really didn't sell well, but it sold enough to get 2 sequels, Psychonauts and the Rhombus of Ruin, and Psychonauts 2.
Ratchetto to Koronku, I think I did that right. Also known as Ratchet and Clank, is an action platformer from the era of Sly and Jack. It was created by Insomniac, the same folks that did Spyro. So we'll cover them in a future episode. The original saga consisted of 4 games. The first was Ratchet and Clank on the PS2, featuring Ratchet and his robot companion Clank. You find out some douchebag named Chairman Drek is creating a new planet for his select species, destroying others in the process. And you're the duo destined to save the world. As with most buddy-style games, Ratchet and Clank both possess their own specific abilities, but you'll be playing Ratchet most of the time. It's a great game.
The sequel, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, was actually considered one of the greatest PS2 games of all time. It was better than the previous title and just enhanced the experience in every possible way. You have 18 new weapons, and each weapon can be grown and modified. Oh, and you can also take your weapons from the previous save file and import them into the sequel. The third game was Up Your Arsenal, which without lube sounds painful, but it retained all the ideas of the previous titles. And the fourth was called Deadlocked, which was the sole deviation, bringing in more action-based combat than before, and cutting away the puzzle platforming. All in all, there are quite a few titles, and we'll cover them all in depth during the Insomniac special.
Rayman is an integral part of Ubisoft, and we're honestly on the fence on if we want to do a franchise episode or just include it in the upcoming Ubisoft episode. But in short, Rayman was a massive part of many of our childhoods, depending on what console we play, of course. The original Rayman was a side-scroller that was insanely difficult and featured a last-minute collectathon, but as time went on, it evolved into a 3D space. The interesting thing about this franchise is that they can't seem to decide what creative direction they want to go. Sometimes we have 3D worlds, sometimes we have side-scrollers, and in some cases it seems they want the Rabbids to be the face of the franchise. With 12 games, the franchise has been relatively stagnant lately, but it's worth checking out if you want a classic platforming experience.
Shantae is a side-scrolling platform game that is a cult classic. It's a highly obscure series because it kinda slept in the shadows, but as a Metroidvania-style game, many people recommend it. The first game, simply called Shantae, was released on the Game Boy Color in 2002. This was pretty late because the Game Boy Advance would come out soon after, and all those games tended to overshadow late Game Boy Color releases. In the game, you play as the titular genie, who travels across various levels to stop an evil pirate named Ricky Boots. You use dances to change into different animals, and you collect tons of stuff. It's your generic platformer experience. The follow-up to the main release was Shantae Risky's Revenge, but unfortunately, it was relegated to being a DSiWare title. It's basically the same game with more story.
But worry not, our secret genie heroine would receive a full game on the 3DS with Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. Similar games, similar stories, similar elements. It was one of the best-selling games on the 3DS. In the end, a Kickstarter was started to bring Shantae to where she should have always been, on consoles. This was accomplished with Shantae Half Genie Hero in 2016.
Created by Yacht Club Games with little to no connection to Hollow Knight, this is a much simpler experience. It's a 2D side-scrolling platformer that was crowdfunded. Presented in an 8-bit art style, you play as the titular Shovel Knight as he collects treasures and fights against the Order of No Quarter. That's it. There's the game. All the DLC was also free, so you get to enjoy not only Shovel Knight, but the DLC Plague Knight and 5 other campaigns. Try it out.
Oh man, this series was definitely one of the best on the PS2 with its cohorts Jack and Ratchet. This was the third and final part of the holy trinity of puzzle platformers for the PS2. The first game was Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, and it featured Sly, Bentley, and Murray taking out the Fiendish Five in an effort to rejoin stolen pages to the family book, The Thievius Raccoonus. It was a dynamic game that managed to pull off stealth so effectively that I prefer it to Splinter Cell. True story. Sly 2 Band of Thieves was slightly different, mostly because their missions designed to be played as Murray and as Bentley individually. In this title, we are seeking the parts of the final boss from the previous game, Clockwork, in an attempt to destroy him for good, but somebody already stole them, and fuck, we got a plot. With more levels, more dialogue, more fun, and more frustration, Sly 2 was an amazing follow-up to the inaugural release. The third title was Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves, which follows the events of the previous title.
This time, we can do some stuff with Carmelita Fox, who was a Deuter antagonist trying to catch Sly for the first 2 games. But tons of improvements were made. We're talking pirate battles, aerial combat, clues, safe cracking, tons of stuff. It always seemed like Sucker Punch was one-upping their previous stuff. Then they disappeared. And for a long time, so did Sly. In 2013, though, we were surprised by the sudden release of Sly Cooper Thieves in Time, released by Sanzaru Games. It's a lot like Assassin's Creed, with tons of parkour and individual elements. This was a great way to bring back a legacy franchise, but I don't know if we'll ever see another game like this one.
At some point, we'd love to talk about Insomniac because they made 2 very powerful franchises, Spyro the Dragon and Ratchet & Clank, which we already talked about. So because of that, we're not going to be diving too deep into the series. Spyro was the quintessential platformer grab-a-thon on the PS1. It had gems, it had collectibles, and tons of little missions to help free all these dragons. It would have 2 more releases on the PS1 with Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon, and these titles just kept getting more and more interesting as more and more elements were slowly added. But unfortunately, once the series hopped to the PS2, it started a really bad downward spiral for the franchise.
3 more mainline titles were made, then 3 more rebooted titles, then Skylanders. You know, the amiibos that came to fruition before amiibos were cool? Yeah, imagine buying one game and then collecting 32 statuettes that came with it. You'd easily pay $450 or more just to play the first game the way it was meant to be played, and then they released 5 more titles, each with their own statuettes that didn't interface with the previous game. It was a blatant cash grab. There were also some spin-offs such as Season of Ice, Season of Flame. We'll cover that in a later episode, though.
Sonic had his own major episode last season, but it's important to mention Sonic because during the 16-bit era of gaming, Sonic was a major contender to put Mario in competition. He was fast, he was the face of a system, and boy, did they use and abuse him like a Russian hooker in the Alps. In today's video game industry, I think it's fair to say that Mario took the cake, but back when you had a choice between Sonic or Super Mario World, it could be a tough choice. I wouldn't necessarily classify Terraria as a platformer, but it has platformer elements by technicality. We didn't really have a title that fit the bill for sandbox style stuff, so we figured we'd talk about Terraria. It's a 2D sandbox title that is basically a 2D Minecraft with SNES sprites. That's the best way to describe it. Many times when people talk about the game experience, it's described as therapeutic, calm, and relaxing. It's a genuinely great time for people who enjoy slow, attention to detail based gameplay.
Wario Land is a derivative of Mario, specifically Super Mario Land 3, which was Wario's first self-titled entry. We've covered his backstory and his contributions in the Mario episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show, much like Donkey Kong and Mario, but the cool thing about Wario titles is that they're all simply so charming. They're truly a good time. If you want a refresher, please consider checking out the Mario episode! I worked really hard on it. It came out a long time ago, but I promise it's a good time. And all in all, that's just a small fraction of these experiences that are out there for this powerful genre. If you're like me, Mario and Donkey Kong framed my childhood and taught me what it felt like to do platforming right, and that's a beautiful thing. And if I wanted to feel really fucking irritated, I could go play Super Monkey Ball, another amazing franchise out there.
While the platformers we knew and loved have long since evolved into a more adventure-themed experience, I can't help but look back and see just how hard these companies tried to give us a quality gameplay experience, putting it all out there, not knowing if the public would perceive their ideas as fun or, well, total shit.
And for the companies that failed, don't feel bad for them. Their mistakes led to the perfection of the genre, and even as an adult, I return to those games to remember when life was just a little bit more easy to live. And to be honest, I'm thankful for that.